Hi class, welcome to the second part of lecture today. So we're going to continue our discussion about the, as we call it, speciation of life, how life diversified and became as varied and complex it is here on Earth. So we've been talking about the genetic code and the structure inside the smallest elements of life, the individual cellular organisms. But what we want to do is we want to talk about how we get all the different organisms that we get. So we're going to talk about that process today. That's called selection. And then we're going to use that to launch us into next week's discussion about all the history of life on Earth and the varied life forms that we see. Those are going to be the foundational systems of life that we're going to use to develop our intuition for how we start looking for life elsewhere. Okay, and so that's coming in the very near future. We'll start with our discussion of life here in the solar system, and then we'll extend that to life in the distant parts of the universe. Okay, so behind me today, you can see cow. Cows will play a prominent discussion in today's lecture. Okay, so let me go ahead and start some slides. Okay, so this is a famous butterfly collection of Alfred Russel Wallace. Alfred Russel Wallace was one of the two people to discover natural selection is the driving force behind evolution of life on Earth. You probably know his contemporary, who is probably more well known than Wallace, who is Charles Darwin. And we will talk about both of them eventually. So Wallace was discovered this natural selection at more or less the same time as Darwin. He published a paper which pushed Darwin to publish his Origin of Species, but Wallace was inspired by his own trips into the tropical parts of the world. In particular, he went to an area in Southeast Asia, Malaysia, and Singapore, and those areas, and that's where he started collecting butterflies and moths. And so this is one of his collections, which he was quite proud of. You can see there the giant atlas moths in the center, but what you should see here, which is what Wallace noticed and what drove him to start thinking about natural selection and its impact on the diversification of life, is the similarities between all of these life forms. Okay, so they all kind of look the same. They have wings with the same kind of structures, with the same number of lobes. They have antennae, they have bodies, they have 6 legs, the whole 9 yards, but then they are also quite varied. And so these are the sorts of things that he was thinking about that drove him into this question of how does life get the way that it is? Okay, well, that process is what we call selection, and we're going to talk about both artificial and natural selection. Okay, so we'll start by talking about artificial selection, because artificial selection is easy to understand, it's easy to see in action, it happens on very short time scales, and we can do controlled experiments with it if we wanted to. We'll then talk about how the same ideas work in nature. So that is what we call natural selection. It happens on much longer time scales. And the kind of key thing that we care about there that's going to be involved in our discussion of astrobiology is this idea of fitness. Okay, so not fitness like, you know, go pump iron with Arnold Schwarzenegger or someone, but fitness in the biological sense. And we'll talk about that. Okay, and then we'll mention Wallace and Darwin because they'll play a prominent role in our near-term discussions next week. Okay, so I want to start the discussion, as I promised, with a very simple question, which is, where did cows come from? Okay, now that seems like an odd question to answer, and it is, but I think it kind of really illustrates the point that we're after. If you'd like a slightly different question, which we'll also talk about and we'll come back to, is if you look at life forms, you see commonalities among all of them. So another type of question you could ask is this one, is what's the deal with all the different eyes that we see in nature? So here are just 4 examples: a peregrine falcon, a horse, a goat, and a flounder. They all have eyes, they all have 2 eyes, but if you look at them, their eyes are all very different. They're positioned differently, they're shaped differently, they have different structures in them. And so what's the deal? How do they all have eyes, but do they all have different eyes? How did nature get that way? Okay, so these are the sorts of questions that lead you down the path of thinking that Wallace and Darwin both went down. Okay, so the question of artificial selection, I think, is easiest to approach by just looking around you at domesticated animals and plants. And so here are several examples. We have pets, whether they're cats or corgis. We have domesticated farm animals, cows, horses, chickens, whatever. We have domesticated plants of all varieties. We have things like carrots. We have ornamental plants like garden roses, corn, whatever. Okay, so where did all of these things come from? Are there wild corgis running around the earth that were convinced to lead a simpler life, letting the humans take care of them, and they can sit around it and be fed and be judgmental of our actions? No, none of these things that we show on this slide, none of the domesticated plants and animals appear in the wild. So the question is, where did they come? Where did they come from? Okay, and the answer to that question is we made them. There are ancestors to every domesticated plant and animal that do exist in the wild. But today, the plants and animals that are part of our everyday lives, whether they're pets or domesticated creatures in farming or plants that we use for whatever purpose, those varieties have been grown by humans and developed by humans over very short timescales, 5,000, 10,000 years, into the creatures that we see today. And so the question is, how did we do it? Okay, well, the answer to that is so-called artificial selection. What artificial selection is the intentional breeding of organisms to encourage certain physical characteristics or certain traits, behaviors, whatever, and to discourage others. Okay, so the classic example is shown here. So this is a figure you can see in your textbook. Is you'll recognize around the outer edges of this figure all kinds of vegetables that you and I eat, or if you don't eat vegetables, that your mother encourages you to eat. Okay, broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, kale, kohlrabi, right? These are all unique and distinct vegetables that if I go to the grocery store, I see them on the produce shelf, okay? But all of them derive from wild mustard, which does appear in the wild, but none of those others do appear in the wild. You can't find a stand of raw broccoli out in the forest preserve if you go walking around in the spring looking for broccoli. Okay, humans created broccoli and now we farm broccoli. We created it from wild mustard. How did we do that? Well, you went at wild mustard, and when you see wild mustard that has really strong flowers and stems, you take those mustard plants and you grow more of them just like them. Okay, until eventually you get a strain of wild mustard which strongly presents itself. What used to be ordinary flowers and stems, like in that mustard plant there in the center, present themselves as what you and I call broccoli. Okay, in a similar example, we may see wild mustard that has terminal buds that are really leafy and tightly packed and very fibrous. Okay, and so if I take those mustard plants and propagate them and grow them over time, the stem-like structure of the mustard, I bred it away so that terminal bud got very big and very fat and heavy, so it could just grow on the ground. And today we have cabbage. Okay, all of these things you see around here, we bred by looking at the wild mustard that was growing around us, or the cultivated mustard after we had started trying to domesticate it, and encouraging the things that we wanted. We wanted big edible terminal buds, then we keep those mustard plants and we encourage them to grow. And if the buds are too small, we don't grow any from that plant. If the buds are big, we grow more from that plant. And over time, we end up with cabbage, or we end up with Brussels sprouts or cauliflower, or whatever it is that we try and grow, okay? So the lesson for the plants here, they didn't have any choice in this. We forced this on them. But the plants that survived are the ones that had the traits that were most desirable to humans. Okay, same thing's true of our pets. This is where house cats come from. This is where corgis come from. It's where our friend the cow back there came from, right? We started breeding other creatures to our own purposes. Cows come from a breed of creatures called aurochs. They are no longer exist. They are extinct in Europe. The last one died in the 1650s, I think. Okay, but if you go back thousands of years to when humans first started domesticating what became cows, you will see cave painting of aurochs, and today they have evolved into our pal Bessie back here. Okay, so if the humans like you, they breed the traits in you to encourage them. They make lots of offspring that look just like you, and that's how your genes and your structure and form propagate. Okay, so the lesson here is that selection, the evolution of a species into what it is today by choice, is not something that you as an organism have any control over. Selection is imposed by outside influences, in this case by the humans that were trying to domesticate you. Okay? Now, what Wallace and Darwin both realized is that this process, which humans drive on very short timescales by just kind of aggressively breeding generation after generation after generation of plants or animals that we're interested in, this process must naturally happen in nature as well. Okay, and so the question is, what drives it, right? What causes changes in life forms to happen in nature? Why do I have foxes and coyotes and wolves? What drives those changes? And then how does nature decide to keep some and not the others? Okay, well, that process is called natural selection. Okay, so the basic premise of natural selection is the universe is a very harsh place. Pretty much all it's ever trying to do is to kill you. Okay, and you, if you're some life form, living your life out on, some beautiful planet like Earth in the universe, you encounter death all the time. Some days you escape it, and some days you don't. Okay, so the example here is shown by this diagram here in the middle. Is imagine an ecosystem which has some prey, in this case mice, represented there in the bottom of the figure, and a predator, in this case a hawk, above. And in this environment, the ground on which the mice live is colored in a way that is similar color to some of the mice. Okay, the gray mice there you see are colored similarly to the ground that they live on, and other mice are light colored in comparison to the ground. What that means is in this ecosystem, if the hawk is looking for dinner, the mice he's going to see most readily are the ones that stand out against the background. And so the hawk, when it eats, it preferentially eats light-furred mice. Okay, so you get to the middle slide there. And so the mouse population is decimated every season by hawks coming in and chawing down and eating mice. And what you end up with is a population which has a few light-colored mice, the ones that escaped the talons of the hawk. Okay, but then you have a lot of dark colored mice, and if they get together and they hang out and they make lots and lots and lots of baby mice, well, the mice that get preferentially made are the ones which are preferentially represented in the population. There are more dark colored mice than light colored mice, so in the next generation of mice there's lots of dark colored mice, and over time the hawks will decimate and remove the light colored mice, and in the end you'll end up with some species of mice that are just dark colored. Okay, so that's an example of a trait that helps you survive. Okay, in the similar way when we were talking about artificial selection, the trait that helped you survive was something that the humans liked about you. Here in the natural world, the trait that helps you survive is the trait that helps you avoid death. Okay, and this is what we mean by fitness. Fitness is a quality that gives you survivability compared to the other organisms around you. In the case of the mice, in the example that we've just given, the fitness criteria, the survivability trait, is the color of your fur. Okay, those traits help you survive, which help you make more copies of yourself, which help there to be many more of your species in whatever environment you find yourself in. Okay. Once again, just as was the case with artificial selection, the influences that affect the growth of your species, the propagation of your species, are imposed from the outside. The reason the dark mice survive over the light-colored mice is because there's an outside influence, the hawk hunting. If you remove the hawk from this picture, there's no reason why light-colored mice would survive preferentially over dark-colored mice, and you would end up with both species as you propagated through. Okay, so once again, selection is imposed from the outside. Okay, now here's another example of natural selection. So natural selection works because life is prolific. Okay, there are many variations of organisms that happen all the time. So in the example here in the first frame there, you have many different colors of bunnies. You got dark bunnies, you got light colored bunnies, and you got in-between bunnies. And all of those varieties are caused by the fact that the different bunnies are interbreeding with each other and mixing all of their genetic codes. And those genetic codes allow lots of different varieties of bunnies to arise. Okay, well, what happens is, just as in the case with the hawks and the mice, in this particular environment, which is a snowy environment, the way this figure has been drawn, the bunnies that are standing out against the environment are preferentially killed, and in the end, you're left with just the light-colored bunnies. Okay, so over time, the dark species of bunnies will die out. Now, the reason I showed you this figure is that there are some traits that are innocuous and some that are helpful and others that are not. So in particular, before there were predators, it was debatable whether or not it mattered if you were a white bunny, a dark bunny, or an in-between bunny. In principle, dark bunnies and in-between bunnies are kind of the same, but it's an innocuous mutation. It doesn't matter that there are medium-colored bunnies or not until the predators show up. Now, the other reason I show this is if you look at the predator, you'll notice that the predator is white. Okay, that's a survivability trait. The predators are evolving at the same time the prey is evolving. Okay, so why is the white predator, why is the white fur a good trait for the predator? Well, if you're a white predator, you blend into the background so the bunnies don't see you coming, and so you get fed and your offspring get fed, and you preferentially survive over the dark predators. Okay, so selection is happening all the time in natural systems, and it's this constant balance of what's helping and what's hindering and what doesn't matter at all between all of the life forms involved. Okay, but the keys to this are life and death. The key to selection is lots of varieties of life being created, and then the ones that aren't very successful being killed off, so only the successful ones survive. Okay? Now, this is basically what Wallace and Darwin deduced. And typically, especially when you're talking about something like how long does it take you to go from a population of, dark-colored bunnies and light-colored bunnies to a single species, that happens over very long periods of time. Generations of bunnies are at least a year apart, and the evolution of bunny fur color is very slow over long periods of time. So as humans, we may not notice it. But fortunately, there are systems, and certainly in the age when you and I live, where we can watch this selection process happen very, very rapidly. Okay, so I'm going to show you a video here. This is a famous experiment that was done just a couple of years ago at Harvard Medical with their colleagues at Techion in Israel. They basically built a table-sized petri dish. It's about 2 foot by 4 foot, as you just saw there marked in the picture. And then what they did is they divided the table up into individual strips. Okay, and on the ends of the strips, they just leave it the raw material that they make the petri dish out of. And then in successive strips, they put antibacteria material down that has 1, 10, 100, and 1,000 times the lethal dosage to kill E. coli bacteria. Okay, so the antibiotics are laid down. Then they put E. coli on each of the ends, and then they just watch the E. coli grow for 2 weeks. So this is a time-lapse movie over the course of 2 weeks. And what you see is the E. coli very rapidly grows until it hits that first barrier of antibiotics. And then it pauses. And then all of a sudden, what you see there is a colony of new bacteria start growing, and eventually other colonies start growing, and it expands across the next band of the antibiotics until it hits the barrier again. And at the 10 times barrier, it pauses, but then it starts growing again and expanding till it hits the 100 times barrier. And then it pauses and it keeps growing until it hits the 1,000 time barrier. Okay, and what you see here is this very complex structure in the movie, and everywhere the structure branches is a new type of bacteria that is evolving and growing because it has developed resistance to the antibiotic. It has learned how to survive the obnoxiously destructive environment that it found itself in. Okay, and so what this branching structure shows here is the evolution of quote unquote new species of E. coli bacteria as they grew and adapted to the environment that they were in. This is natural selection in process, in action. So the E. coli hit a place where the antibiotic that was presented was not in any way hospitable to its survival. And so it just stopped. It could not exist there. But bacteria propagate and develop very rapidly, new generations of bacteria on very rapid timescales. And so a mutation, a new form of bacteria eventually appeared where suddenly it could survive in that antibiotic environment. And so it started evolving across the barrier, and that's the growth that you actually saw there. Okay? So there's the YouTube link for that video. You can go watch this yourself. The thing I want to point out about this video that I think fascinates me, and it's just kind of really the deep thing to think about, is that on the two ends where we started, we put exactly the same species of bacteria down. But as the 2 weeks went along and the bacteria evolved across, each time the bacteria evolves into one of the new bands, the solution that was created was completely different than the solution that was created elsewhere. So every one of these dots is a completely different and unique solution to how the bacteria dealt with the antibiotics they encountered as it was going across the giant petri dish. Okay, so that is kind of the amazing thing about this, is that the bacteria that meet in the middle, even though they started out the same on the ends, are completely different from each other, which is kind of cool. Okay, so what's the deal with the eyes then? So the eyes are the natural realization of natural selection and process. Again, the general philosophy about eyes is that eyes are developed to help you survive. Maybe they're helping you obtain food. Maybe they're helping you avoid predators. Okay, so in the case of the peregrine falcon, raptors are predators. They have very keen eyesight. They're watching from above, and so their eyes are on the front of their head, and they are very, very good and accurate eyeballs. By contrast, a horse or a goat, they are prey creatures, okay? And so their eyes are on the sides of their heads so they can see, but in a much wider field of view to watch for predators coming to eat them. Goats in particular, you notice they have those weird pupils. I don't know how many of you grew up on farms, but I grew up in the country. And so goats do not have round pupils like you and I. They have elongated, almost square pupils. And those are very good at having wide fields of view. And similarly, a flounder flounders, you see all kinds of adaptations there to help it survive. The color of its skin helps it blend in with the sea floor. Its body is actually evolved to exist on its side. You see it there very flat. And so as a consequence, both its eyeballs are on one side of its body so that when it's laying flat on the seafloor, its eyes can look up and watch for predators. Okay, so eyes have evolved from a common origin somewhere down in the long history of life on Earth, but they have evolved to be very adapted to the specific environment that each of these creatures find themselves in. Okay. So this was the great realization of Alfred Russel Wallace and Charles Darwin, that natural selection is the process that drives the speciation of life on Earth. Okay, and so that's where we'll start next class period. We will talk about how life on Earth developed and expanded, and the history of life as we know it, and how we determine that history and what it tells us about how we should be looking for life on other worlds. Okay, so I hope you all have a great day, have a great weekend, good luck with everything, and we'll talk again soon, okay?